Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
But if you could tell the story.
Sure. So the battle at Roberts Ridge was at a mountaintop known as Takur Ghar in eastern Afghanistan in early March of 2002. The SEALs were part of the SOF unit, a recon element for a larger big army push into what the military believed at the time was the last valley of stronghold of Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters. And there was a deadline to meet, and the SEALs, a small SEAL recon element from SEAL Team 6 from Red Team, went in by helicopter. One of the operators, Neil Roberts, fell out the back of the helicopter after the helicopter was hit by enemy fire at the top of the mountain. The helicopter recovered. Eventually, the team, the surviving team, went back in looking for him. That led to another ambush, an extended firefight with some Al-Qaeda fighters. It was a very entrenched position. Neil Roberts was killed pretty quickly. The SEALs didn't know that, but he was killed pretty quickly. And then the combat controlman, who was the CCT attached to the Red Team, John Chapman, was struck. The two other SEALs in the group were hit. They blew smoke and retreated to save the remaining guys. Chapman was left believed to be dead. Turns out he was not dead. He later recovered from his wounds and fought alone at the top of the mountain for about an hour before a QRF comes in with Rangers primarily. Another somewhere, I think there's a total of 7 who died that day. There was another 5. They were not all Rangers, 4 Rangers, I think, and another Air Force, maybe a PJ, who was killed on the mountain. Ultimately, they got the Americans took control of the mountain, but they lost 7 servicemen, as I said, the first member of SEAL Team 6. In the aftermath of Roberts Ridge, the SEALs discovered that Neil Roberts had been mutilated and that the enemy, in fact, it had been seen on the ISR coverage as it was happening in certain places. One of the guys, the enemy had tried to cut off his head and almost did, but it failed. And when his body is brought back to Bagram, and this I didn't know until I did the book, I actually had asked you guys whether this was normal. I was told that this was very unusual and not normal. They basically had most of his teammates, almost all of them, come in and view the body in that condition.
Christ.
And that there was and I talked to some people who were there when it was happening, and there was a long line waiting. Needless to say, it was a very traumatic event. They had lost their first teammate.
Right.
Chapman died. There's a secondary scandal and issue with Chapman that we can get into later.
Get into that later.
But suffice to say, what happens here is sort of 2 things. SEAL Team 6, for the first time in their history, is in real war and combat. Right. The reality is that until 9/11. In JSOC and when Special Operations, SEAL Team 6 was JV to Delta. It just was. They never got picked for the missions. They finally broke through in Bosnia with one of the snatches, and so they started to pick up steam, but they were never the first choice. Now we're at war, and SEAL Team 6 is on the front lines, and they get faced with a horrific situation in which their team leader Britt Slabinski is essentially ordered to go up to the top of a mountain and violating all the basic principles of reconnaissance against his own recommendation to his officers. And I just want to stop here and say that one of the things that is most interesting, I think, about understanding the culture, and I think that's obviously true at Delta as well, but SEAL Team 6 Dick Marcinko built the unit so that the officers command, but the senior enlisted lead. And so when Slabinski says, I need 24 hours more, and he is told basically shut up and get to the top, he's following his orders. And so it's not, it is not his responsibility that they were sent up there. But it's also the capitulation from the E7 or the E8, who definitely knew better than the two men who were ordering him up there, right? He knew better. And it's something that he said, in the interviews that I published, he talks about. He knew he was violating this cardinal, this basic rule of recon. And it was eating at him immediately, right? So they sort of have this really awful event. They have this horrific thing happen to one of their teammates, and in the immediate aftermath, and I mean immediate, they went on some of them, not all of them, some of the unit went on for what later became known as revenge ops. They were after blood. And so, it's trite, but they went up one way and they came down another, right? The guys who were on that mountain did not come back down the same, and it trickled through most of the team because of the nature of the way the unit was. And there was this sort of other element, which is that we can get into the squadrons, but at the time it was Red Team, and they were known as the Red Men. They had a mascot, a Native American mascot. And so there was this identity issue that grew. And in the immediate aftermath, there were war crimes very quickly afterwards, within 24, 36 hours, by the SEALs, some of the SEALs, including one of the officers. And so it's your starting point of understanding post 9/11 how things change. And some of it is obviously they had a culture of cover-ups in the SEALs and in SEAL Team 6 unit. But the other thing is let's be honest, right? It was war for the first time. These guys were seeing war for the first time.
Well, and not only was it war, but they saw a friend of theirs, a teammate, somebody who they had spent time with, who they knew personally, having been savaged, not just killed, but savaged. Yep. And I can definitely understand sort of that mentality of, all right, well, let's get some. Right.
I don't think, I think that it is fair to say that most people can relate or appreciate to that feeling.
Right.
To the notion that there is an eye for an eye and justice needs to be served, that there needs to be revenge. I think what your officers will tell you is that that's all well and good, but we have a law, we have rules and regulations, and we need to keep it within the bounds of what's acceptable. And I think, what someone said to me one time was, it wasn't that there was ever really one moment where we had just gone, where the whole unit had gone totally off the rails. What they said was, on each deployment, there were groups of guys in each squadron that would go too far.
Right.
But what would happen is they were never pulled back. Never.
Right.
In 15, in 20 years. And so the officers never did anything about it.
Right.
And so each deployment, the line moved. So that by 10 years later, and I get into it in the book, you get Britt Slabinski 7 years later, actually from that instance, 5 years later, asking for a head on a platter. And there's a debate about whether it was metaphoric or whether it was literal, but some of his men took it as a direct order.
Right.
And tried to obey and comply with it. And that was just one of what was a very bad and very rough deployment in which there was a view that the only way to defeat the Taliban was to be more savage than the savages.
Right.
Right? Dehumanize the enemy and treat them as they treat the civilian population.
Right. And so it's not just warfare, but there's also psychological warfare involved.
And so what I would say is that there is a through line from what happened in the immediate aftermath of Roberts Ridge to what happens later, right? It's a culture, and there's a lack of accountability, and that's part of one of the central stories. Unfortunately,
and so where were the officers? Why weren't the officers pulling them back, or like saying, hey, we need to change these guys out. Like we need somebody to come in and fill in for them so they can decompress because they're wound really tight right now.
It's an excellent question. The shortest answer is that in many of the cases, not all, but many of the cases, the officers who were leading these men were, at SEAL Team 6, the respect for officers from the enlisted comes from guys who had the kind of experience they did, who had gone through Green Team, who were trained and qualified as assaulters. After 9/11, in several cases, because they had to surge up numbers, officers were allowed in who had not gone through Green Team. So immediately you have a problem because those officers have no respect from the enlisted. And so the officers are leading from behind and from the position of they need the respect of the men, and the way to be respected is to be liked. You don't get liked by being enforcing discipline and good order, good order and discipline as the Navy requires it. And so what you have are officers who look the other way. You have officers who encouraged it, sometimes not using, one of the things that's hard to write about are all the euphemisms and there's no directed. They sent messages just with looks, with body language.
Could you dive a little bit deeper into the culture of each of the squadrons? Because I think this part is really interesting in how each squadron in Dev Group has its own identity and how that kind of expressed itself over the years.
Yeah, sure. So, there are